introdurre il discorsetto di conferimento del premio a Barry Smith, che ha la seguente motivazione. La prima edizione del premio Paolo Bozzi per l'ontologia è conferita al professor Barry Smith per il suo rigore nella rifondazione dell'ontologia analitica e per la sua creatività nello sviluppo dell'ontologia applicata. Invito il professor Smith a venire qui a prendere questi oggetti che secondo il professor Rossi non esistono, cioè il diploma. Questo è più complicato, questo è ancora più materiale, forse tu che sei pratico.
No, io tengo la scatola.
This is where you need applied ontology.
Applied ontology, this is applied ontology. So. Allora, you should sit here. E allora adesso passiamo alla laudatio del professor Smith e poi il professor Smith ci farà la sua lezione. Se in un'isola c'è un gran sasso nero e tutti gli abitanti si sono convinti, con elaborate esperienze e molto uso della persuasione, che il sasso è bianco, il sasso resta nero e gli abitanti dell'isola sono altrettanti cretini. Questa frase l'ha scritta Paolo Bozzi, ma avrebbe potuto scriverla Barry Smith. Un realismo a tutta prova e anche un certo gusto per la provocazione unisce due personalità così diverse. Mi verrebbe quasi da fare due vite parallele nello stile di Plutarco, ma non preoccupatevi, sarò molto più breve, anche perché il pezzo forte di questo pomeriggio è la conferenza di Barry Smith che inizia la serie delle Paolo Bozzi Lectures in Ontology. Così mi limiterò a dire per quale motivo questo premio è intitolato a Paolo Bozzi, perché si è deciso di inaugurarlo assegnandolo a Barry Smith e perché lui ha compiuto una scelta così opportuna intitolando la sua relazione How to do things with documents, o a voler mettere la cosa in termini più personali, perché sono grato a Paolo, perché sono grato a Barry e che cosa deve loro il Labonto. Incominciamo dalla prima palla del dittico, Paolo Bozzi. Ci sono dei maestri che si cercano e altri che si trovano, ci si imbatte in loro in modo imprevisto e si impongono con quella stessa necessità della realtà incontrata nel mondo che il percettologo Wolfgang Metzger aveva contrapposto alla realtà rappresentata nella testa. E sicuramente per me Paolo Bozzi è stato un maestro trovato. Ero arrivato a Trieste nella prima metà degli anni '80 come giovane professore di estetica e con la testa piena di ermeneutica. L'idea era quella classica che il mondo è la mia rappresentazione e che consiste in ciò che riesco a farci con le cose che penso e gli schemi concettuali che adopero. Però alle sedute di laurea vedevo, prima ancora di capire, le tesi degli psicologi. Mi sembravano qualcosa che non aveva nulla a che fare con la filosofia, con tutto quel parlare di figure e sfondo, immagini consecutive, pregnanza e buona forma. Più tardi avrei conosciuto i lavori di Bozzi, partendo quasi dal fondo, con Fisica ingenua, uscito nel 1990, anche qui imbattendomici per caso, grazie al mio amico Pietro Cobau che me l'aveva prestato. E l'avrei frequentato così come ho poi frequentato i suoi allievi, cominciando dal primo, Paolo Legrenzi, già a Trieste e poi in tanti altri luoghi e occasioni. Ma l'impatto era venuto proprio da quelle tesi così sconcertanti per un ermeneuta. In un certo senso, in quelle discussioni sul vedere si trovava ciò che in linguistica si chiamerebbe conservatorismo delle aree laterali. Come in Quebec sopravvive il francese del Settecento, così la psicologia triestina conservava un retaggio austro-ungarico. Il punto da cui muove Bozzi, nato nel 1930 in una Gorizia italiana da 12 anni, è compendiato in un motto del suo maestro Gaetano Canizza, una figura quasi mitologica che aveva incrociato a Trieste, intorno a cui alleggiavano gli spettri di Musatti, Benussi, Meinong, sino a Brentano, o meglio indietro sino a Brentano. L'occhio, diceva Canizza, se proprio si vuole che ragioni, ragiona comunque a modo suo. C'è un'autonomia del vedere rispetto al pensare, di qui l'interesse per le cosiddette illusioni ottiche, in cui l'occhio non ubbidisce al cervello, che però Bozzi, filosofo prima ancora che psicologo, trasformava in un'autonomia del mondo rispetto ai nostri schemi concettuali. Con questo semplicissimo gesto, Bozzi stabiliva la possibilità dell'ontologia e al tempo stesso si smarcava da un dogma endemico tra filosofi e psicologi del secolo scorso, ossia che non esiste un mondo là fuori, si ripeteva con un certo compiacimento ricalcando l'inglese out there, e che tutto si riduca a una battaglia tra schemi concettuali. Per Bozzi invece quel mondo c'era e con la sua autonomia che si spingeva sino al livello dei significati, con una consonanza con le tesi dello psicologo americano James J. Gibson, che lo aveva detto dopo di lui, ma che Bozzi aveva generosamente contribuito a tradurre e a far conoscere in Italia. Una sedia, in parole povere, significa possibilità di appoggio tanto per un uomo quanto per un gatto. Poi certo si può risalire a significati a cui il gatto non accede, per esempio stile Luigi XVI, ma l'inizio è proprio lì, nel mondo esterno. È senz'altro una chiamata di correo, ma l'ontologia che nel 2001 ho proposto nel mondo esterno, in parte già nel 1997, la rivalutazione dell'estetica come aistesis, come sensazione in estetica razionale, prendeva l'avvio proprio da Bozzi, che mi aveva aiutato a uscire dalle secche dell'ermeneutica e a elaborare un'ontologia realista. Le parole che avevo messo in esergo, dedicandogli il libro, ex te ipso excede, in exteriore homine habitat res, erano una variazione rispetto alla frase di Agostino citata da Searle alla fine delle meditazioni cartesiane, noli forasire interedi in interiore homine habitat veritas. Volevo sottolineare come l'ontologia richieda una scelta preliminare per l'esteriorità e la causalità rispetto all'interiorità e alla verità. Prima degli schemi concettuali e dell'epistemologia c'è il mondo esterno. Era per l'appunto l'insegnamento che veniva da Bozzi, che aveva sviluppato una fenomenologia senza epoché, cioè senza messa tra parentesi l'atteggiamento naturale. Tavoli e sedie, amici e parenti, sono davvero tavoli e sedie, amici e parenti, e non semplici fenomeni. Così pensiamo quando non ragioniamo da filosofi, e il bello è che il più delle volte non ci sbagliamo, perché il mondo è in larghissima misura così come ci appare. Non è una rappresentazione, è un tutto pieno di caratteristiche che appartengono agli oggetti prima che ai soggetti. Questa affermazione è molto potente e radicale tanto quanto il dubbio di Cartesio, e altrettanto coraggiosa in tempi così inclini a credere che la realtà si risolva nel pensiero. Su questa base sarebbe davvero troppo azzardato costruire un'epistemologia, visto che i sensi possono ingannare e la scienza richiede comunque schemi concettuali. Ma un'ontologia sì, il mondo esterno non è la verità, come forse avrebbe detto Bozzi, bensì il punto d'appoggio, un punto d'appoggio sufficientemente forte per un'ontologia caratterizzata da ciò che ho proposto di chiamare inemendabilità, la resistenza e l'attrito di quel che c'è. Appassionato lettore e osservatore, Bozzi non era preda a una qualche frenesia di raccolta e pubblicazione delle opere. Ci hanno pensato per fortuna altri amici, a cominciare da Ugo Savardi e Ivana Bianchi, che ci onorano della loro presenza, per inciso. Viveva con sua moglie Margherita Breitenberg, che qui fra noi ringrazio di essere venuta, tra Bolzano e l'altipiano del Renon, sopra Bolzano, da cui si allontanava ogni tanto per conferenze, a volte a Torino, è stato il primo presidente del Centro Interuniversitario di Ontologia Teorica e Applicata, e per la sua grande passione, anche teorica, suonare il violino. Aveva il telefonino, ma lo teneva spento. Non ha mai scritto un'email, scriveva molto parsimoniosamente con una lettera 32. Paolo è morto nella sua casa di Bolzano nella notte tra il 10 e l'11 ottobre del 2003. Sono passati 7 anni, molto tempo soprattutto adesso, ma non c'è bisogno di un premio per dimostrare quanto sia vivo in noi e fuori di noi. Ed è proprio per dimostrare questa continuità di pensieri e di interessi che abbiamo deciso di assegnare la prima edizione del premio a Barry Smith. Michael Dummett ha detto una volta che chi avesse letto Frege e Husserl all'epoca della pubblicazione delle loro opere non avrebbe tratto l'impressione di due mondi separati. Dammet proseguiva dicendo che come il Reno e il Danubio, che nascono vicini e sfociano lontanissimi. Ora, credo che il senso di questa unità ritrovata sia proprio offerto dal lavoro di Barry Smith, tra le cui primissime pubblicazioni c'è la cura, nel 1981, di Structure and Gestalt, Philosophy and Literature in Austria-Hungary and her Successor States. Seguiranno moltissimi altri lavori, da solo o con i suoi compagni di dottorato a Manchester, Kevin Mulligan e Peter Simons, in cui si assiste a una mediazione in grande stile fra le due grandi tradizioni di pensiero. Una mediazione che, contrariamente a ciò che solitamente avviene, non è realizzata sulla forma, che resta strettamente analitica, bensì sulla sostanza, che si è appoggiata su tre punti caratterizzanti. Il primo è l'allargamento e la fondazione filosofica del realismo. In opere che hanno saputo congiungere ontologia formale, psicologia della Gestalt e sensibilità ecologica, Smith si è impegnato nel conferimento di un'autentica portata ontologica alla fisica ingenua. Non si tratta semplicemente di rivendicare l'esperienza di un mondo impermeabile alle leggi della fisica esperta, ma di riconoscere e formalizzare le leggi che regolano il mesocosmo, l'immensa sfera di oggetti di taglia media che riempiono la nostra realtà quotidiana. Il realismo però si unisce a un elemento del tutto peculiare di Smith, e cioè il pragmatismo. Non parlo della corrente filosofica, ma dell'attenzione alla dimensione applicativa della filosofia. Oggi assistiamo a una singolare trasformazione dell'università. Tutte le discipline, anche le più astratte, devono essere professionalizzate, e con questo si viene a toccare la stessa essenza dei saperi umanistici. Al tempo stesso però non si pensa che l'applicazione non può consistere nel ridurre la filosofia alla semplice descrizione della cultura di massa, poniamo. Bisogna farne qualcosa di più, e questo di più è per l'appunto un dialogo alla pari con i saperi e le tecniche alte e decisive. Sotto questo profilo credo che nessun filosofo al mondo sia così attivo e creativo come Barry Smith. Nel 2001 Smith ha ricevuto dall'Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung il più ricco premio filosofico della storia. $2 milioni. Difficile competere, ed è per questo che il premio alla Bonte è privo di attrattive venali, d'accordo con l'adagio di Petrarca, povera e nuda vai filosofia. Il premio della Humboldt gli ha permesso di fondare l'IFOMIS, lo Institute for Formal Ontology and Medical Information Science a Saarbrücken, che per primo ha iniziato una ricerca ontologica su larga scala nelle scienze biomediche. Non era che il primo passo. Oggi la lista delle attività e direzioni di Smith è lunga come quella delle onorificenze di un maresciallo sovietico alla parata del 1 maggio. Dirige lo US National Center for Ontological Research, ha fondato l'Open Biomedical Ontologies, è fondatore e responsabile scientifico delle iniziative Ontology for General Medical Science, Protein Ontology e Infectious Disease Ontology. E questa parvenza militare si conferma se si considera che Smith collabora con lo US Army Net-Centric Data Strategy Center of Excellence, cose, mamma mia, ma l'apparenza bellicosa si attenua se si considera che Smith collabora anche con Hernando de Soto a un programma per sviluppare la crescita economica nei paesi sottosviluppati. Con questo veniamo al terzo elemento caratteristico di Smith ed è la declinazione sociale dell'ontologia, in cui, con una sintesi originale, si propone la confluenza di tre tradizioni quanto mai eterogenee. Anzitutto il realismo ontologico di Reinach, la convinzione che gli oggetti sociali non siano semplici fantasie nella testa dei soggetti, ma risultino anzi solidi come alberi e case. In secondo luogo, l'apporto più marcatamente costruzionista che viene da Searle, l'idea che la realtà sociale sia il risultato di attribuzioni di funzione per cui degli oggetti fisici come pezzi di carta e persone possono diventare degli oggetti sociali come, ad esempio, dei diplomi di premi ontologici e dei premiati. E infine, questa è davvero la mossa sorpresa, l'apporto di De Soto, che sottolinea il ruolo delle rappresentazioni, comprese le rappresentazioni scritte, nella costruzione di quel pezzo così importante della realtà sociale che è il capitale. Personalmente Sono molto riconoscente a Smith che in un articolo del 2003, indicando una difficoltà nell'ontologia di Searle, rendere conto di quelle entità che apparentemente non hanno corrispettivo fisico, come gli oggetti del web o i debiti, mi aveva fatto venire in mente l'idea della documentalità, che combina quello che per Berry probabilmente è l'acqua santa, la costruzione della realtà sociale di Searle, e il diavolo, la grammatologia di Derrida. Ricordo con quale attenzione aveva accolto questa proposta la prima volta che l'ha sentita in un incontro organizzato da lui, a Saarbrücken, il 18 gennaio 2005, in un memorabile seminario sugli oggetti sociali. Quel discorso l'ho poi sviluppato in una critica a Searle e a ciò che mi sembrava insufficiente la teoria di Berry, il fatto che insistesse sulla rappresentazione invece che sulla scrittura e sui documenti, in Dove sei, uscito pochi mesi dopo. E mi ha fatto un grandissimo piacere vedere che le mie osservazioni erano state accolte da Berry quando, il 20 giugno di quell'anno, è venuto da noi a parlare della Invisible Ontology of Documents. Ho sempre sospettato che quando Husserl parlava di spirito europeo e diceva che si estendeva dall'America ai dominion inglesi, non includesse il Sud America né l'Europa meridionale. L'importanza che Berry ha dato alle teorie di De Soto, mie e ovviamente di Paolo, dimostra che i tempi sono cambiati. Grazie.
So first of all, while the screen comes down, I would like to thank Maurizio and the University of Turin and Labont and all of you here for coming to this event and for the great honor of receiving the Paolo Bozzi Prize. And I would like to thank, in this connection, Mrs. Bozzi, and through her, transitively, any souls or spirits who are falling within this beam of gratitude. So this is the title of the talk, How to Do Things with Documents. And this is part of an ongoing effort which involves Maurizio, Hernando de Soto, and various people interested not so much in paper documents as in digital documents. I'm going to talk a little bit about digital documents, but primarily I'll be talking about how to do things with paper documents. And this is a condo in Florida. Yes, this is a condo in Florida. We would all like to have one of these, I'm sure. But there are some difficult document acts which need to be performed before you can have one of these. First of all, you need money. And typically, in the year 2007, for instance, you would go to a bank and you would take a loan. You would have a mortgage with which you can buy a beach condo, which would mean that you would get another piece of paper which would be the title of the condo. In 2008, however, you might see the value of your condo collapse, which means that you still owe the bank roughly $1 million, but your house is worth only $500,000, which means that you are faced with a problem. And you might solve this problem, as many people did, by simply walking away from both your beach condo and your mortgage. The bank loses. You are relatively unscathed by this experience. But unfortunately, the world is somewhat more complicated, not for you, but for many other people. So these are some of the objects which are involved here. We have the bank, the condo, the price you originally paid, the price that you could get in 2008, your mortgage contract, your signature on the mortgage contract, your mortgage, your commitment to repay the mortgage. You did something which I would say is unethical. But in the American legal system, your behaving unethically is relatively easy to get away with. So your credit score goes down, but you can rebuild your credit score. The problem was that your mortgage, which was bestowed upon you by your bank, was then bundled with hundreds of other mortgages to form a new kind of investment vehicle called a collateralized debt obligation. And this was sold on to hundreds of other investors who had a tiny piece of your mortgage. Now, your mortgage is now a very peculiar kind of object. It's in ontological limbo. No one is paying back your mortgage, which means that the value of the collateralized debt obligation, which includes your mortgage bundled with hundreds of other mortgages, many of which are equally problematic, is also in ontological limbo. And so at best, those CDOs collapsed in value. Now, that was very interesting, because when the CDOs collapsed in value, many other things collapsed in value owned by similar groups of investors, and many, many people, including, I imagine, people in Italy, suffered as a result. So, the question I want to address is, I think, a practically very important question. What are these structured investment vehicles like CDOs? And I believe that we can learn something of general interest about ontology and about the world and about documents by thinking about this question. Now, first of all, a CDO is something like a mathematical structure. It can be divided into 1,000 identical parts in the way that is not possible with a home or a house or a lake or a factory. And it can be added to 1,000 identical CDOs to create a new bundled CDO, which can then be divided into 463 identical parts. So these things are treated as if they were mathematical objects. Their values in 2007, when these things still worked, were calculated using very, very precise statistical tools. But on the other hand, a CDO, as we discovered, is very much a historical entity. So we're talking about entities which have mathematical-like properties, but which are also subject to time and change. Now, Plato, and with Plato, many, many philosophers, the impractical philosophers, ever since, would have regarded that kind of combination of mathematical abstractness and historical change to be impossible. As we shall see, John Searle regards that kind of combination as being impossible. I think that understanding that combination is indispensable if we're going to understand many of the entities which people our world, in large part as a result of the existence of computers. But we will come back to that later on. So, CDOs are not physical and they're not mental. They're not concrete and they're not abstract in the full sense of the word abstract. They're not entia rationes, but they're also not entia realis. They are quasi-abstract historical entities. But they're also normative entities. So when you get one, you get, in some sense, a collection of obligations, or part of a collection of obligations. They can be bought and sold, they can be aggregated and sold and stored, and so forth. So they can be subject to a whole series of very special kinds of actions, which are not physical actions, but they're also not mathematical actions. So just as we can ask the question, what is a CDO, so we can ask the more general question, what is a debt, or what is a mortgage, or what is a mortgage contract? Or what is a signature? Or what is a credit card? Or what is a credit card number? A credit card number, too, is a quasi-abstract historical entity. It's not a number. It's not a mathematical entity. You can't divide it or multiply it. Now, as we all know, Plato and Kant and Quine and so forth don't have any answers to these kinds of questions. German philosophers with whom I used to collaborate would regard these kinds of questions as being beneath the dignity of a philosopher. These are questions which have to do with cooking, a kitchen question. Now, actually, I think that these are precisely the kinds of questions that test the power of philosophical theories. If we can't produce a good account of these things, then we're lost, because these are just the tip of a gigantic iceberg, and this gigantic iceberg is going to become more and more important with time, because more and more areas of reality are beginning to be transformed by the influence of computers. All right, so fortunately, all is not lost, because gradually ontology is becoming an independent science. So this is, let me see if I can make my light work. No. So you can see ontology here freeing itself from the philosophical mothership. Gradually, there will be departments of ontology, at least one in the University of Turin. And these people will communicate much more directly with computer scientists, biologists, and economists than do the philosophers of our time. Now, just as an interlude, this process in which we are just participating in our own day is a process which is primarily, so far, playing itself out in the north of Italy. And this is a very puzzling phenomenon, which we will come to in a minute. Let's just see how the process is happening. These are Google hits in the year 2004 for ontology plus Heidegger. Now, the Heideggerians were very slow to use computers. But the Aristotelians, too, were embarrassingly slow. But already in the year 2004, there were almost 10 times as many websites devoted to ontology and information systems as were devoted to ontology and Aristotle. In 2009, the Heideggerians are beginning to use computers. But there are now 9.37 million websites devoted to ontology and information systems. So the philosophers have lost. There is no future for philosophy when it comes to ontology unless they get with this program. Now, in the world's first research group devoted to ontology in this sense, ontological engineering, was founded in Padua in the year 1991. This is something of which in the future Italians will be able to be justifiably proud. It was founded by a doctor of engineering by the name of Nicola Guarino. And I can see already some people in the room are smiling because they know Nicola. In 2003, Nicola moved to Trento to form the Laboratory for Applied Ontology. And this is the website of the Laboratory for Applied Ontology. Performs basic and applied research on the ontological foundations of blah, blah, blah. And last year, Nicola and his colleagues formed the world's first International Association for Ontology and its Applications, which is still primarily based in Italy, although gradually it is becoming truly international. And as we all know, in Turin, in 1999, in Turin, what may be the world's second ontology research institute in the modern sense was founded by Maurizio, and this is the Laboratory for Ontology. So he was doing something right already in 1999. He probably wasn't realizing what he was doing. And then there is the Paolo Bozzi Prize in Ontology, which also has something to do with northern Italy, and which is the world's first ontology prize. Now, why is this new burgeoning ontology discipline a characteristically Italian phenomenon? So, just as psychology became a science in its own right in Leipzig and Graz in the 1890s, I want to argue, so ontology began its journey towards becoming an independent discipline in Trento and Turin in the 1990s. Now why? Why northern Italy? Now, this is the view from Rome. And the view from Rome is, what can you do in northern Italy? They have no pasta. They have these polentini, they have no food, so they do ontology. Now, another part of the story, I'm sure, has to do with Paolo Bozzi. So there was a strong influence in northern Italian universities of the Graz School of Gestalt Psychology through Benussi, Musati, Canizza, and Bozzi, and others. And the leading Italian figures in the ontological world today are all in one way or another influenced as philosophers by Paolo Bozzi. And I'm sure that this is part of the reason why northern Italy has become the home of so many ontological activities. Now, IFOMIS, which was the world's first center of biomedical ontology, was not founded in northern Italy. It was originally founded in Leipzig, but then I moved this institute to Saarbrücken for complicated reasons. I wanted to get away from Moscow, basically. The IFOMIS but it was also founded in a way as part of the same tradition as the tradition which Gorizia referred to which Paolo Bozzi belonged, which is the tradition initiated by Brentano in Austria in the broader sense, to which also belonged the great phenomenologist Edmund Husserl, who coined the term formal ontology. Formal ontology was first used by Husserl in logical investigations, and we chose it as the name of the IFOMIS Center because we wanted to apply the methods of formal ontology sketched by Husserl already in the 1900s to medical problems. And so that's what we did. And that's what I'm still doing. Medicine and biomedicine are, as you can imagine, very complicated regions for a practical ontologist. And the first thing which I discovered when I started working seriously on the ontology of medicine was that there are already very many ontologies of medicine which are being used by medical information systems and so forth, and they were all at that time very, very bad. All right, so I have been applying ontology since the year 2002, primarily in the areas of biology and medicine, but not only in the areas of biology and medicine. So these are some examples. You can see that there are some chemical examples here. The Kebi ontology is also something I've been working on. I am not responsible for all of these, but I am working with the developers of all of these in different ways. So we have an environment ontology, for instance. We have a plant ontology. But in addition to these biomedical ontology projects, I've also been working for the US Army and now for various other such agencies where they have an immense problem of ontology. And basically their problem turns on the fact that an army nowadays doesn't march on its stomach, it marches on its information systems. And the army has produced hundreds of information systems, all of which use different ontologies. And if those information systems need to talk to each other, which increasingly they do, then there arises the need to have some sort of a common ontology. And I've been working with the agencies within the US Army who are trying to create a common ontology, not just for the Army, but for other kinds of government activities, for instance, in the realm of energy and justice. And so this is one of my PhD students who is now a lieutenant colonel in the US Army. And he is one of many army ontologists. Now, this is not a joke. If you had asked me 10 years ago whether ontology would truly be being applied seriously by any major institution, then I would have thought you were crazy. But it turns out that not just the army, but very many large government agencies are taking it as a matter of course nowadays that they need ontologists. This is true for drug companies, it's true for big financial companies. Every organization which has large amounts of data information systems which need to communicate with each other, is gradually realizing that the only way to do that properly, if you can do it properly at all, is going to involve ontologies. And the ontologies can either be good ones or bad ones. Now, that was an interlude. I'll now go back to the original issue, which is how do we deal with the ontology of things like debts and obligations and money and mortgages. Now, one important tradition within the history of attempts to understand the ontological status of such entities is, of course, the theory of speech acts. Now, the theory of speech acts is normally associated with Anglo-Saxophone philosophers such as John Searle and J.L. Austin, but in fact, the first speech act theory in any serious form was put forward in 1913 by a student of Husserl who was a realist ontologist in the sense that we've been talking about here, by the name of Adolf Reinach. Reinach was much more interested in the ways in which we use speech acts to create new kinds of legal entities. Reinach was a philosopher of law, and so he was interested particularly in things like claims, obligations, and rights. And his idea, which overlaps with Searle's and Austin's ideas, was that we can change the world by speaking. We can speak, and thereby a claim comes into existence, and the claim then endures. And it's this understanding of the ways in which we can do things with words to change the world, which forms the basis, I think, of any correct account of these strange kinds of entities. The problem is to try and get a correct account of entities like debts, permissions, names, and so forth. In other words, social entities. How do we understand the social reality that we create, in part by speaking? Now, these things, claims and obligations and so forth, do not exist alone. They come in systems. And for instance, the marriage system or the mortgage system or the legal system, these are all systems of entities which have been created through speech acts. And traffic laws are another such system. So the traffic works. The roads work. We can get from A to B, if we're lucky, on the road because we have an elaborate system of traffic laws which rest upon claims and obligations of various sorts among all of those who use the roads in order to move from one place to another. So this is these systems of claims and obligations are the foundation of social coordination. Social reality is what enables social coordination, is what enables the acts of multiple people to be coordinated. And that social reality must exist if the acts of multiple people are to be coordinated. So traffic laws, like roads, exist. That's what the realist would say, of course. Now, when we're dealing with simple examples of claims and obligations, for instance, when I promise Maurizio that I will give him 10 euros tomorrow, then the claims and obligations can be understood in rather simple psychological terms. I am concerned that my good name in Maurizio's eyes will survive, and so I give him back the money. I feel obliged to give him back the money for psychological reasons. And he has a good memory, so he will remember tomorrow that I owe him 10 euros. So we can understand local claims and obligations psychologically. But nowadays, we're dealing with social reality which extends across continents, indeed across planets in the future. And there, memories and good intentions and our desire to keep our good name will no longer suffice. If we're trading with people in China, they don't care that Maurizio is such a well-established figure. They want to know more about Maurizio than something psychological. And so we have a puzzle. How do we understand the force of claims and obligations across distances and across times which embrace whole continents, or which might indeed endure beyond the life of the people who make the obligations at any given time? How can we deal with the fact that debts, for instance, may be bought and sold? I make a debt to Maurizio and he sells my debt to some mafioso friend. And the debt moves around. It's sold on in Wall Street or somewhere. Now, the answer is that the power of claims and obligations across large spaces and times is ensured through documents. So documents substitute for the psychology of memory in order to enable claims and obligations to have powers which extend beyond the local village society. That's the main thesis. So with the invention of documents, we have a new dimension of claims and obligations, which makes claims and obligations not transient, ephemeral, local phenomena, but enduring phenomena, which themselves can be bought and sold. And then we have things like bank accounts, stocks, shares, bonds, credit cards, and so forth, which themselves form new kinds of social networks, which rest on new kinds of document systems, which were unknown in the era before socio-economic documentality began to exist. That's another version of the thesis. Social reality of the sort that we now take for granted is a product of complex systems of documents. Now, what can we do with documents? Well, we can sign them and store them and register them. We can inspect them. We can keep them in archives. We can check them. We can destroy them. We can forge them. We can combine them together. So we can combine mortgage documents signed by the mortgagee with mortgage documents signed by the lawyer with mortgage documents signed by the bank to create a documentary picture of corresponding relations between all of the agents involved in creating this mortgage document. So we can iterate, that we have a recursive phenomenon where we build documents upon documents, documents about documents. And again, we form document systems of ever new sorts. So not only do you have a CDO, you can have a CDO squared, which is a CDO which rests not on mortgages, but on other CDOs. Now, the first person to understand the importance of documents in creating modern commercial reality was Hernando de Soto, who is the head of a think tank in Peru called the Institute for Liberty and Democracy. Until recently, he was the head with Madeleine Albright of a UN agency for the legal empowerment of the poor. He has worked with the heads of state of more than 100 countries in attempting to solve the problems which are created when poor people live in homes or work in factories, but they don't have legal title to their homes and factories. And so basically they are easy victims for squatters or for criminals, including criminal politicians. And Bill Clinton describes De Soto's project to give property documents to poor people and thereby empower them as the most promising anti-poverty initiative in the world. And in Peru, it has had very clear positive effects already in simple ways. In most of the poor areas of Peru, poor people didn't have title to their homes, which meant that they needed to have a member of the family live in the homes during the day when people were out to work. And usually this would be the daughter. When De Soto, after years of very, very serious effort, transformed the poor areas of Peru so that people did have legal title, the literacy rate of girls in Peru increased by a significant percentage because the girls could go to school for the first time. All right, so De Soto wrote a bestseller, been translated into many languages, called The Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else. This was part of De Soto's effort also to defeat the shining path in Peru, which was exploiting the situation of the poor for reasons having to do with terrorism. He wanted to improve the situation of the poor basically by moving Peru into the Western world of documents. The reason why capitalism works in the West is because we have better documents. And his idea is that documents don't merely enable people to have title to their property, they also enable people to own many more things. So you can own, for instance, a tiny fraction of a factory, which is impossible if you need to own the stones or the machines, but if you can own a paper representation called a share in the factory, then you can be part of the development of industrial Peru. It gives the occasion for new types of legal accountability and for new types of business organization, which in the pre-documentary world were impossible. So, De Soto's idea is that through the performance of document acts, we change the world by bringing into being new kinds of ownership relations, new kinds of legal accountability, and so forth. So the mystery of capital, in De Soto's terms, is explained as follows. Capital is born when we represent in writing the most economically and socially useful qualities of assets. The moment you focus your attention on the title of a house, you have automatically stepped from the material world into the universe of documentality, as we might say, where capital lives. So property documents make possible the reliable means to discover the most potentially productive qualities of resources. They open up a new world. And in this way, they give rise to that quantum leap in human welfare which we associate with the successes of Western capitalism. We are rich because we documented our property. Therefore, we got mortgages. We could use those mortgages to improve our property or to invest in a factory or to do whatever else is necessary in order to turn the wheels of industry. But this only works if we can trust the documents, which means that we must be able to see the documents and understand the documents. The documents have to be published in ways which allow transparency. And Western societies have worked out how to create such transparency. There are rules and regulations governing how stocks and shares can be issued, governing how property titles should be constructed and so forth. Through legally authenticated written statements to get the facts about things of value. The problem was, and this was made clear in various pieces that De Soto wrote in connection with the credit crunch, is that for the era, or for the phenomenon of CDOs and other such structured investment vehicles, there were no rules and regulations. These things were created in the dark. The chain of representations that had earlier anchored commercial paper to the underlying assets was broken. So, documents representing derivatives were not centrally recorded, and so there was a resultant lack of transparency of information about what grounded the debts. So the reason why Jim's defaulting on his mortgage led to a collapse of the investment markets was because no one knew how many Jims there were. And no one knew precisely how many Jims there would be next week, because no one knew what the structures of these CDOs and the CDO squareds and the CDO cubeds and so forth was. There was an epistemological shortfall in result of an ontological misunderstanding, or failure to understand, better still, since no one really tried to understand CDOs from an ontological point of view. So the value of derivatives depends upon knowledge of the underlying assets. The chain of documentation must be preserved. So that's the end of part one. Now part two, which is shorter than part one, is about Searle. Searle has come closer than anyone else in the world of philosophy to trying to grapple with these kinds of problems. And I believe that this face is familiar to many people since Searle has been in Turin. The problem with Searle is that he's a naturalist. He is not a realist. What that means is that Searle thinks that everything in reality is something which can be described by physics and chemistry. Now that means that we can have presidents and cathedrals, so we can even have dollar bills. We can even have prime ministers, because they're made of chemicals. But what we can't have are debts or collateralized debt obligations, because they're not made of chemicals. And so Searle has a problem. How do you deal with debts? So Searle also can recognize the existence of documents, because documents are made of molecules. Driver's licenses, speeding tickets, and dollar bills and so forth are all perfectly good examples from Searle's point of view of social reality. They fit within his naturalism, but they are part of the social world. Now, the problem begins when we think about not dollar bills, but the money in your digital bank account. So in 1998, Searle says, all sorts of things can be money, but there has to be some physical realization, some brute fact, even if it is only a bit of paper or a blip on a computer disk. Now the problem is you can't use a blip on a computer disk to buy a horse. In 1998, he was arguing that blips on computers can be money. Thanks to me, since I argued with him vociferously about this point, he realized in 2003 that blips on computers are not money. Rather, they represent money in much the way that mortgage documents represent an underlying debt. So I got him this far. But now he's faced with the problem again, because this representing money means that he needs to have money which is not physical. But everything in social reality for Searle has to be physical. And just as money has to be physical, so debts, claims, property rights, laws, and so on have to be physical, but they don't seem to be the kinds of things which can be physical. So this is a dilemma. So the things at the very heart of social reality are not entities described by physics and chemistry. Searle is stuck. Just this year, he's published a new book called Making the Social World, The Structure of Human Civilization, in which he thinks he solves the problem. He now says the most general logical form of the creation of human reality is here. We make it the case by declaration that a Y status function exists in a context C. Now the Y status function is in turn cashed out in terms of powers that real physical entities, namely human beings, have. So when Jim is promoted to police captain, we make it the case by declaration that he has the powers to issue instructions to his constables, or to fine you, or to do other things which police captains can do. This is the story which Searle tells, and it works fine for the police captain, just as it would work quite fine for a prime minister. So Jim is still a physical, biological object. In result of the declaration, we all accept that he has these and those negative and positive powers. Those powers make up social reality. And then the same applies to every other kind of non-physical social object, to money, debts, claims, obligations, according to Searle. The universe in the new book still consists entirely of physical particles in fields of force, for instance, persons. To say that a person possesses money means to say that he has certain powers. So if I have money in my bank account, I can write a check and give it to you and eventually buy a horse. A corporation transacts business because I and the chairman and the treasurer of the corporation have similar powers to press a button, write a check, buy a horse. But there are always people with powers. Everything in the social world is cashed out in terms of people with powers. Now, the social world is incredibly complicated, and so this story will work only because the formula, we make it the case by declaration, can be applied recursively. So as he puts it, nearly all of human civilization is created in its initial existence and maintained in its continued existence by this single logico-linguistic operation of declaration. But all the bearers of the social powers are persons, They all have, however, complex powers which build upon other complex powers. And a good comparison here would be with linguistic powers. If Maurizio says P, I can say, if P, then not Q would imply that you are a moron. And in this way, I build language, and thereby build my own powers to use language, recursively on the basis of his use of language, and then we all join in and create ever more complicated linguistic structures. And in this way, Searle says, the enormous diversity and complexities of human civilization is explained by the fact that the operation, we make it the case by declaration, that can be applied over and over to the outcomes of earlier applications and with various and interlocking subject matters. So this is what we are asked to believe. Collateralized debt obligations are the consequence of individuals with complex iterated powers. Now the problem here is that collateralized debt obligations don't exist for Searle. What exists are the people with the powers. But also money doesn't exist. The money in your digital bank account is not made of chemicals, and so it doesn't exist. Debts don't exist. Rights don't exist. Persons are real, and their powers are real, but money does not exist. So in his new book, Searle says, the recent economic crisis makes it clear that money and other such instruments are products of massive fantasy. He has to say that. They can't be real because they would fall outside the realm of naturalism. They do seem to exist, but this is just as if money itself does not exist. It's a product of fantasy. Now, so the ontology of stocks and shares goes something like this. We have this incredibly complicated fantasy with lots of people with powers. They can press buttons. Stocks and shares, as we all know, the realists in this room, are indispensable to ensure coordination of the actions of people exercising financial powers. But, according to Searle, stocks and shares do not exist. Now, this is a bit like saying that roads are indispensable to ensure coordination of the actions of people exercising transport powers. That's a misprint. But roads do not exist. They are products of massive fantasy. You can't understand the traffic unless you believe in roads. You can't understand the stock exchange unless you believe in stocks and shares. But according to Searle, I think probably Searle would have to say that roads do not exist because of the concrete which supports the roads exist. The roads themselves, leaving roads aside, Searle says that money does not exist. Now, he's gone, this is wrong, clearly. So where has he gone wrong? First of all, he's confusing two dimensions. One is loss of value and the other is loss of existence. The fact that CDOs collapse in value doesn't mean that they went out of existence. Or indeed that they never existed in the first place, which would be an even worse mistake. Secondly, he makes a false analogy between CDOs, the euro, particularly the Greek euro, the doctrines of communism and so on, which can collapse at any minute, and what goes on in the theatre. So money is theatrical for us from Searle's point of view. It's a structure of, an incredibly elaborate structure of false belief. But thirdly, and I think most importantly, given that this event is devoted to Paolo Bozzi, he contradicts his own robust realism. So this is the argumentum ad obviosum, which in other circumstances Searle himself was happy to apply. As he says, if someone tells you that we can never really know how things are in the real world, or that consciousness doesn't exist, or that there is nothing beyond the text, he doesn't say that bit, but I put it in there for Maurizio's sake, then you should not be afraid to say, I know that's false. Now, similarly, if somebody tells you money does not exist, then you should not be afraid to say, I know that's false. And if you don't want to say that, give me your money, please. So, The De Soto thesis we could formulate as follows. Documents and document systems are mechanisms for creating the socio-economic orders of modern societies. Now, Maurizio has, I think, developed a generalization of this De Soto thesis, which he formulates as follows. Through the performance of inscribing acts, for instance, acts of signing a document, we change the world by bringing into being social objects. So social reality, according to Maurizio, is brought into being by writing. In general, not just in the economic sphere. Now, this is a big improvement on Derrida, which is saying very little, of course. Derrida says there is nothing beyond the text. This is nonsense. Maurizio says there is nothing in social reality beyond the text. This is a big improvement. It still may be wrong, but it's a big improvement. So what we need is a theory of documents. We need to know what documents are. We need to know what we can do with documents. And Maurizio and I agree completely that we need to work out in what sorts of ways documents are disseminated in society, sustained through acts of recording, in what sorts of ways is social reality sustained through documents. Documents represent reality, but they also sustain the existence of reality. Now, these are new kinds of questions, and I am very honored to be in Turin, in the home of documentality, and to be able to address these questions here. Thank you very much.
Bene, signori, risulta dal programma messo lì in fondo che a questo punto io devo dichiarare tolta la seduta, e questo è un atto linguistico seguito da atti documentali. Poi ci sono tutti questi oggetti. Mi stavo chiedendo come farà Barry a portarselo in America. If you want I can ship it to you, but
I'll test its weight.
ok. Comunque, dichiaro dunque chiusa, ringraziando ancora una volta tutti voi per essere venuti qua, le autorità che hanno presenziato a questa cerimonia, gli amici che sono venuti qua, e soprattutto il premiato Perry Smith, e ringraziandolo anche per il discorso che ha fatto questo pomeriggio. Dichiaro chiusa la prima edizione del premio Paolo Bozzi per l'ontologia, e poiché due oggetti sociali possono sussistere nello medesimo oggetto fisico, anche la prima Paolo Bozzi Lectures, e con questo vi aspetto, chi vuole, la settimana prossima, no, l'anno prossimo, per la seconda edizione. Grazie.